Hello and welcome to the Euranet Plus debate. This is the first in a series of online panels with journalists, lawmakers, and citizens across Europe during the coronavirus crisis. Euranet Plus, a leading radio network for EU news, will be getting different perspectives about the outbreak, the lockdowns, and the economic recovery. I'm Dave Keating, and today I'm joined by a panel of radio journalists from across Europe to talk about the lockdowns. Which countries have the tightest restrictions, when were they put in place, and why they weren't better coordinated. We'll also talk about when and how they will end. Here joining us from their homes are Pedro Caeiro from Radio Renascença in Portugal, Hannah Murphy from radio station FM 104 in Dublin, Ireland,
Hi.
And Florin Orban from Radio Romania International. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us. Now, as we enter the third week of lockdowns, we have the European Commission preparing a coordinated exit strategy for lifting the lockdown measures across Europe. They were tasked by the Council of 27 national leaders to do so. And according to Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, these countries now realize that it was a mistake not coordinating the introduction of these measures. She said this week that without such coordination for exiting, European countries will undermine the effectiveness of the tough measures they took. But we still have no indication of what the timeline will be. Von der Leyen says that if the measures are lifted too early, it could risk a health collapse. But if they're lifted too late, it would risk an economic collapse. The Commission is consulting with the European Centers for Disease Control, the ECDC, to devise the best timeline. But this, of course, will have to take into account the fact that different countries are at different stages of the outbreak. Italy and Spain may be emerging out of their peaks right now, but countries like the UK and Belgium may not yet have experienced their peaks. Almost all EU citizens are now in some form of lockdown, Sweden being the big exception. Now, these lockdowns range in severity. In Italy, people can only leave their homes to go to the grocery store once a week or to the hospital. But here in Belgium, the rules are much more lax. We can still go outside to exercise, for example. Here, the lockdown is due to last until 19th April, with the possibility to extend until May 3rd. And we're told this extension is likely. So let's turn to our panel of journalists in the European countries. Now, Hannah, let's start with you. Ireland has been in lockdown for some time now. What's the situation there and how are people responding?
Yeah, so in Ireland, it's been a really gradual process. Some people would say that we started this lockdown quite early. We took strong measures only a few days after having our first case here, and Ireland's been widely praised for that. Now, I know you've been talking about the plan from the Commission. The thing is, in Ireland, because we don't have a land border with, Italy, Spain, other European countries, that's not as big a focus for us. The bigger issue is the UK, because we have a land border. We have Northern Ireland, there's a border there, and Northern Ireland is governed by the UK, which is taking a totally different approach to, or in the beginning was taking a totally different approach to Ireland. So that had been our bigger concern. The situation at the minute is officially our restrictions are until April 12th, Easter Sunday. And that means that schools, colleges, creches are closed, non-essential workplaces, public transport still running for essential workers, and we are really only supposed to go out for supermarket runs, and we can go out for exercise, but it's limited to within 2 kilometres of our home. It's expected that that's going to be extended. Ireland hasn't reached a surge that you might expect. We did have an address from our Taoiseach, or in English you would say Prime Minister last night, Leo Varadkar, and he said that, we have somewhat flattened the curve. I'm sure you're probably using that phrase yourself, flatten the curve, try and reduce a peak. We were expecting an increase of 30% of cases per day. Our restrictions very early on meant that that's been brought down to 10% increase rate per day. The only thing is we can't really keep that up, and it needs to be brought down to 5% or less in order for our healthcare system to be able to manage.
Pedro, there are restrictions also in place in Portugal. What's the situation there?
Well, we have been in what we call a preventive state of emergency for 2 weeks, for a period of 15 days in very exceptional cases, and it had never happened in 45 years of democracy in Portugal. There are rights that are in the constitution that have been suspended. This is the case with the right to move freely, to call for demonstrations, to strike. There was also the possibility of putting soldiers on patrol missions on the streets. Land borders were limited. The Portuguese airlines stopped flying abroad. It was decided to close the schools, giving financial support to parents who have to stay with the youngest at home. Home study was promoted through online classes at different levels of education. Companies were forced to opt for teleworking to the fullest. I, for example, have been doing the morning news from home for 2 weeks in a home mini studio that was set up here at home. The National Health Service was reinforced with military and private hospitals as well. Essential services such as banks, post offices, state services are kept to a minimum. Supermarkets, butchers, grocery stores, pharmacies were forced to be open. A whole lot of shops closed. Restaurants can only cook for takeaway, and there cannot be many people at the same time in these closed spaces. Public transport can only take up to 1/3 of the capacity to be able to cover safety distances between people. However, yesterday, the Parliament approved a 2-week extension of this state of emergency. The government has decided to tighten up the need for confinement. It is very likely that schools will not reopen before the summer holidays, and that there will be classes online or by television. Then we will close all airports in the Easter period. Since midnight, gatherings of more than 5 people are illegal, and a declaration is needed for those who have to move to work during the 5 days of Easter, between 9 and 13 of this month. We have a problem with preventing contagion in prisons. Therefore, the government will propose a partial pardon of sentences up to 2 years for less serious crimes, or for elderly or more vulnerable people who may see the sentence completed. We are talking about 1,200 prisoners. Out of this pardon are cases of homicide, rape, crimes of domestic violence, or child abuse. You asked for the people's reaction to these measures. In general, here people understood very well. They are afraid for their health, not least because we have the tragic example here alongside Spain, but also Italy and France. There have been days of great uncertainty about the evolution of the disease, which has been more or less slow, but people have adapted either to work from home or simply to stay home most of the day with their children. Just go walking the dog or do some urgent shopping. There are movements by artists who have been doing concerts online. There are theater companies with plays that can be seen at home online. Teachers and schools giving classes by video conference. Obviously, the levels of anxiety have increased, but people are resigned and waiting to be able to return to normal when it's safe.
Florin, tell us about the situation in Romania.
Hello from Bucharest. Well, the last figures here in Romania show almost 3,200 confirmed cases, 116 dead, and 280 persons cured. Talking about the lockdown, well, here is quite severe, with people allowed to leave home only for essential shopping, for work, for going to the doctor. The persons aged over 65 are allowed to get out only for the mentioned purposes, but only 2 hours per day between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. Patrols of the army were deployed to help the police and the gendarmerie. But I would say the restrictions are quite respected, not always, and that's the reason the government increased, starting yesterday, the fines for non-respect of the rules at a minimum of 400 euro and a maximum of 4,000 euro. Of course, there were minor incidents here and there, people in the streets for no valid reasons, and thousands of fines applied for not respecting the lockdown. Well, the biggest problems are related, I would say, to the economy, with hundreds of thousands of working contracts which were suspended, and more than 100,000 people already lost their jobs.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about those economic effects because, of course, with every day that these lockdowns go on, the economic effects are compounded because people aren't able to work. We may be getting an exit strategy from the Commission the week of April 6th, and that's going to suggest how and when we can start exiting from these lockdowns. What are you guys hearing from your national governments about when the lockdowns will be over? And have there been any suggestions about what might be the first measures lifted and what might be the last? Because obviously this will be done in stages rather than all at once. Hannah, what are you hearing in Ireland?
There hasn't been, they're very reluctant to give an indication of what will be the first measures to be lifted, because as I said, we haven't hit, if you want to call it a peak, we haven't hit that yet. If I was to guess, I would say this day last week, our Taoiseach / Prime Minister announced that people who are over 70 and people who are at risk, who have underlying conditions, have to cocoon. That's the phrase we're using. They have to self-isolate and not leave their homes. So I would imagine, because that is such a strict measure, that may be one of the first ones to be lifted, but we're not near that time, I wouldn't say yet. As I said, officially, our restrictions are on, there until the 12th of April. It's widely expected that they will last longer than that. In terms of economically, it's not good. Our employment rate, we were nearly at full employment before this hit. Now 500,000 people are unemployed. The unemployment rate has gone to 17%, and our Prime Minister Taoiseach Leo Varadkar last night told us the economic situation, in his words, is very, very bad. So that's
Pedro,
where we're at.
Sounds like it's not so much information about when we might be getting out of this. Pedro, is that also true in Portugal, that we're not getting much information about the exit?
Yeah, these new measures and the previous ones to limit the effects of the pandemic imposed a high restriction on the operation of thousands of companies. Firstly, in the commercial sector, there are thousands of restaurants that have simply closed. Tourism stopped, and it's a vital sector for Portugal. The government has been helping families. For example, there is no cut of water, electricity, gas, eviction from homes for lack of payment. And the state has tried to help companies because if it lets them die, we lose the ability to relaunch the economy and we are left with high unemployment. The idea is to protect everyone as best as possible for 2 or 3 months in order to survive, overcome this storm with the fewest deaths possible, and then have the best possible conditions to relaunch the work activity and be able to recover the economy. On the 17th of April, the state of emergency can be renewed. Everything indicates that it will be so. A slow return to normality is only expected towards the end of May if everyone collaborates. It will be gradual. Gradually, they will restore services to normal levels. Then they can start letting people be on the streets more often. And I think that between May and the end of June, everything is back to normal. For example, we knew today that the football championship should resume on May 30 and end at the end of July, but the games will be without an audience.
Florian, do you have a sense of what the government in Romania would like to see from the Commission in terms of an exit strategy?
Well, Romanians are placing many hopes in the efforts of the EU institutions and authorities, but concretely the government expects for now more financial and logistic support, especially when it's about providing the protection equipment for the medical personnel involved in fighting the disease in the Romanian hospitals. Nevertheless, it's also expected that the EU takes measures to help the industrial sectors most affected by the crisis, to ease the circulation of merchandises through Europe, and especially food and medical supplies, in order to have the union function really like a union, not like sum of countries which for now mostly are protecting their own borders and their own in such situation.
Indeed, we definitely saw a retreat toward national interest at the early stages of these crises. We have time for one more quick question. I'll put it to Hannah, and that is, how is the lockdown affecting your ability as a journalist to do your work and to access politicians?
Well, basically, I am working from home, as you can see. In terms of access to politicians, I mean, it's a funny one as a journalist because in some ways you've never gotten to speak to some people more because everyone is sitting at home, everyone's working from home, and everyone's looking for something to do and an escape. So in that sense, you know, it's been a good contact making exercise, if you want to call it that, if you need to find a silver lining. And there are government briefings every day. There's updates from our chief medical officer every day, and they are streamed, so all journalists have access to those. They can record them, and then you can follow up afterwards. So in terms of working from home, I mean, I'm a reporter. I've got all my equipment here. It's been okay. It's been okay for now.
Yeah, I definitely echo what you're saying about the strangely higher level of access we're having to politicians all of a sudden while they're at home. Well, that's all the time we have for this week's debate. I want to thank all of our panelists so much for their insights, and you guys can tune in again next week for next week's edition of these Euranet Plus debates. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.